Hey guys, so I've been dabbling with Spright Frog since its release, and so I've been sort of compiling a list of mistakes that I've been making as I'm playing this deck in terms of misplays or illegal plays as well as tips. So I thought I'd just compile them all into one video and share with you guys. I'm sure you've heard several of these tips before from your friends or from other YouTubers, but just thought I'd share this with you, and so yeah, let's just get started. Alright, so let's just start with the most common illegal play, which is when Spright Strutter or Gigantic Sprite's effect is used, where you're locked into twos basically, and of course you should know this by now. And the most common example that gets thrown out is just watch out for that Spright player trying to go into Zeus after using either of these two cards, right? Because Zeus is definitely not rank 2, and they probably, I'm sure mistakenly go into this to try to clear your board. And now, while that one is obvious, a little bit more subtle is when you go into Dark, and I've made this mistake as well, because it is a link to, and you're like, okay, I can still go into this, but the problem is when you're trying to special that dark monster from your opponent's grave, it still has to be level 2, rank 2, or link 2, right? And sometimes, they might just forget and just special whatever dark monster that's and you're gonna be locked into it. And so just make a habit when you're playing against a Spright player, and also if you're playing Spright yourself, just check the graveyard, make sure that starter was not activated that turn, or also if Spright's effect wasn't, Gigantic Spright wasn't used that turn. And that really goes to say, for any time the Spright player summons like a link 3 or higher, realistically to get into like a link 4, a lot of times, like, to get enough bodies on board to get to that point, they probably use starter or gigantic. So which is why Access Code Talker or other link 4s, it doesn't happen too often in this deck. And so anytime something big like that comes out, just make that habit of checking the grave and just making sure that the effects of Gigantic Sprite or starter was not used that turn. Now, the next illegal play is regarding Spright Elf, and while it has really nice effects, something that doesn't get mentioned too often is that it actually cannot be used as link material the turn it's link summoned. So you can't just go into like Elf, bring back like, let's say, red, and then link off into Unicorn and spin back a card, okay? So just watch out for that. If they summon this that turn, they cannot link it away, which is why sometimes, they're going into Gigantic by using this as material and get that beefy attack, but just keep that in mind. Now, sticking with the Elf example, of course, you should know that Elf can only bring back a link 2 or exceeds, or rank 2 rather, monster if your opponent controls a monster, right? So you can't just like willy-nilly, negate with Toad and then just bring it right back with the Elf when your opponent doesn't control a monster. And so ideally, you want to use the Toad negate once they have a monster on board and it's going to stay there. And that's because especially when your opponent doesn't really think this properly, and you Toad negate, let's say they activate a spell or something and they have a monster, and they try to call by the graveyard, at that point then you can just chain Elf and target that Toad and just bring it back, so that called by the grave will not be able to banish it and negate its effect. Although in that example, the Toad, its effect to add from the graveyard, an aqua monster, or water monster rather, you won't be able to do that because of course, Toad came out of the graveyard before that effect can trigger. Alright, the next thing to mention is regarding Dupe Frog, which is a bit of an old card, and it's a when you can effect, which means it can miss timing. And that thing sort of goes over the head for a lot of players, and I'll link down an article that explains missing the timing, because honestly, I'm not the best person to explain that either. But one thing I did want to mention in an example with Spright is, for example, let's say you use Spright Red and like you tribute this off as part of Red's effect to negate a monster effect of your opponent. In that case, Dupe Frog is going to miss timing. You can't just add off, a frog monster from your deck or graveyard after tripping it off. Sort of like, think of it as, if it gets destroyed by battle, or let's say in an example it's destroyed by like Dark Hole or Regeki as Chain Link 1, Dupe Frog could then trigger. But again, I'm personally not a judge and I'm not the best at explaining rulings, so I can just link you to that article in terms of missing timing. But that is something you have to keep in mind with Dupe Frog, even though most players are not actually running this card anymore because of Super Poly. Alright, so this next one is something hopefully you guys already know by now for sure, is that with blue, Jet, and Pixies, aside from level 2, if they're on the board, all of these can special if there's a level 2 on board. But for blue, Jet, and Pixies, they can also special summon if there's a rank 2 on the field, but not link 2, okay? And then the opposite is the true for Red and Carrot. If there's a link 2 on the field, they can also special, but not with rank 2. And so just don't get cheated, guys. It's sort of like with this deck, I find that a lot of times, we just go on autopilot because they just all special themselves so freely, but it is something to watch out for, especially in grind games where they only have, let's say, like an elf on the field and they're trying to like special blue and trying to get their effect. So just keep those restrictions in mind and don't get cheated. Alright, so we're done covering the illegal plays, and I thought I'd just cover some random generic tips as well. One example is, let's say you just brought back Swap Frog from the grave with the Alpha. Just remember that it does have that effect to bounce, and you don't have to bounce itself back. You can actually just bounce back something like the Spright Blue so that you have the follow-up, and it does bounce back as part of class, so even if they for some stupid reason imperm this, you'll still get the blue back. And then, you can do your whole banish Frog for Ronin Totem and then just go into Toad. But just to let you know that that plays there if you have extra monsters on board, so that you can just bounce back for a follow-up. Alright, so this next tip is regarding the Cat Shark OTK, and I know not everyone plays Cat Shark. I mean, I personally really like it because it's a really easy way to OTK your opponent, even under the effect of Spright Starter or Gigantic Spright, because you can do it with just your 2s. And so basically, let's just say in this example, it's a grind game and your opponent passes with no monsters on board, and let's pretend you already used Elf's Effect that turn. So now your turn rolls around, and let's say in your main phase, you just use Elf's Effect to bring back that level 2, and then this is where you now overlay and go into Gigantic Spright this way, because it does allow you to do that with this monster's effect, and then you use its effect to detach so that you can special from the deck. Now keep in mind, guys, also an important wording is that its original attack gets doubled, and that's important because Cat Shark doubles original attack only. And also keep in mind that it only doubles the attack, but it does not double the defense, so just keep that in mind. Anyways, let's just say we use Gigantic's effect, and then blue effect will get the Jet, and then Jet can special, and then Jet use that effect, and we can get that starter. And then let's say in this instance we will just get the red, and of course make sure to take that life point damage. I know it's easy to forget, especially if you're new to this deck, but it is important, especially because in time you are in a bad position with this deck. And so now at this point, so here you would go into Cat Shark, and then you use its effect, and then you detach and you just target basically your Gigantic, which has at the moment 32, and now it gets doubled to 64. So now if you do the math, this becomes 64, 69, and then 81. So when it comes to Cat Shark OTK, something you have to remember is that that third monster has to have at least 1100 attack, which is good for Spright for the most part, except, so don't leave Carrot or let's say something like Swap Frog as your last monster, because those are that's 1000 attack, and so in combined it would end up being 7900, which I've made that mistake once, never again. So just remember this number and the math. It has to be at least 1100 attack in an open field with Gigantic Spright that's doubled and Cat Shark at 500, so keep that in mind. Alright, so the next tip is regarding Salamangreat Almirage, which allows Swap Frog to be a 1-card Spright combo. Now at the same time, so this would only happen, let's say for example, you have Swap Frog and just like 4 hand traps, or let's say something just like unplayable like Talons, Cross Out, Called By, and like Smashers for example. And in that case, that's your only option to do your Spright combo. Now at the same time, there's a lot of players that are not playing Almirage, and it's understandable because in that situation then you're so vulnerable to one hand trap that it might just not be worth it to play Almirage anyways, because your play could get disrupted very easily. Now at the same time, one thing I've noticed personally is where this actually comes up a lot too is actually in a grind game situation where, let's say, because there's a good chance you're going to have Swap Frog back in your hand in a grind game situation, because the Toad's effect, after you negate it, it's going to allow you to get this back to your hand. So in those instances where I don't have much to go with and my opponent also doesn't have any resources left, I do find Almirage has become quite useful, where I would just start the Spright combo essentially, and just, or at least get some kind of level 2 action going on. And so I'll quickly show you how that works. Basically, if this is like your turn 1 play, or just in general, so you use Swap Frog's effect and you would dump the Ronin Totem, and then here you would just link that off into Almirage, and then use Ronin Totem's effect to banish the frog, and then you can special the Ronin Totem, and then now you have that level 2 so that you can go into Elf, and then Elf's effect, you can special out the Ronin, and then from here, for example, you can now overlay, go into Gigantic, and then use that effect. And then for example here you can it sort of depends, you can go into, you can go into like blue for example and just start your plays here. Although going this route, obviously you're not going to be able to get your Toad this turn, you'll be able to get it easily next turn, or you could technically summon out the Swap Frog and then Swap Frog dump another Swap Frog, banish for Ronin Totem, and you can go into Toad, but then you just have Toad and Gigantic. I wouldn't really recommend that personally. So that's just an option that's there with the Almirage if you choose to play it, but I've personally been going back and forth with it, whether playing it or not, so you know, it's up to you, but that line of play is there. Alright, so this last example is a very random tip, but it's something I've experienced while playing against Flunder, and that's when they shifter me. And I decided, for example, to try to add the Smashers to just try to clear their, you know, monster that they summon. But the thing is, because Smasher has cost, you do have to banish that Spright card in grave or hand, and ideally, we're always trying to banish from grave, right? So that we don't have to neg too hard from getting rid of Spright card in our hand. But the problem is, under shifter, you know, your cards are getting banished. So let's say you had activated starter and they shifter you or something for some reason. So just keep that in mind. In my example, when I was playing against Flunder, my Smasher that I added ended up becoming dead because I actually didn't even have any Spright monsters in hand to be able to use this. And sometimes, even when you do, you might not want to because then you may have zero follow-up. So just keep that in mind when you're thinking of what to add off jet under shifter. If Smasher really is the best way to go, or if you just add another starter. Alright guys, so that was it for my random compilation of illegal plays and tips for Spright Frogs. I hope you found that useful, whether you're new or somewhat experienced with this deck. I really like this deck so far. I think it's very, very easy to play for a combo deck, and it's just, you know, it's really consistent and really strong. So that's it for me guys. Take care.